So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this, our very first digital event. We still have a few people joining us at the moment, but hopefully we'll get things underway and they can always catch up with us in a moment. So, firstly and foremostly, I want to say welcome and want to say hope that you and your family are well and safe in what are pretty unusual times. But we're really excited that this launches our digital alumni event series, brand new series today. Our thanks particularly to Professor Bruce Hood for making the time this evening and for joining us for this first event. To introduce myself, my name's Andrew Monk. I'm the Director of Darrow at the University of Bristol. I've been with Bristol now for about 2.5 years, but I've only been the Director for 8 weeks. Quite an unusual time to take over running a department. So why did we decide to launch this series today? Well, today marks Charter Day. So that's the anniversary of the granting of the Royal Charter by King Edward VII to the University of Bristol, which took place in 1909. It's a date that we always try and commemorate, and we felt that this was a great day to launch our digital events. So we have a very proud tradition of absolutely world-class research and outstanding education at the University of Bristol, and Charter Day always celebrates this long history. But it's also important that we use it as an opportunity to look forward. I think now more than ever before, universities are vital to everything that's going on in society. And as a university, our strength really comes from our community. Our alumni are playing such a vital role today in everything that's going on at Bristol. They're supporting our research and students, both philanthropically, but also with the gift of time, volunteering to share their knowledge and expertise and to lend support for our students when they need it. Our medical students graduated early and went out into the world of work to support the NHS. Our alumni stepped in to actually provide mentorship, support and guidance as they started in their professional lives. Before handing over to Bruce, my main role this evening is a few housekeeping rules about our event. Please do bear with us, we're still learning. This is our first one of these, and so this is us trying to find our way as well. So firstly, in terms of the view that you're seeing on your screen, I suggest if you have the option, if you can find the button to press speaker view, it just means that you'll only see the person speaking at any one time. We will make it easier to see as we've got an awful lot of people on this call, which is great to see as well. This session is being recorded and we'll be sharing a link to the recording afterwards, both with everybody who attended, but also we'll be trying to make it more widely available to our alumni as well. So no need to take notes or anything, you will have that to look back on. You can use the question and answer tab throughout, and so please do post questions throughout this evening's event. What we will do is we'll have time at the end for questions after Bruce has spoken. What we'll try to cover as many of those questions and as varied a topic and questions as we can. We have some that have been submitted in advance that we'll start off with, but then we'll be trying to work with the live question and answer. If there is anything that we don't manage to answer that you have a real burning desire to find an answer for, please do email the team following the event and they would be absolutely delighted to try and get back to you with a comprehensive answer. So if you can reserve only asking questions via the question and answers tab, so specifically about the talk, if you've got any technical issues or comments about the event at all, please feel free to email at any time to alumni-events@bristol.ac.uk. They'll be online and can answer any questions. And equally, if you've got technical difficulties, we do suggest you just try closing and logging out of Zoom and logging back in, and often it can reset. At the end of the talk, at the end of all the questions and everything else, we'll enable the chat function, which will allow you to be able to engage with other alumni who are on this call and chat and make contact with them. So that will be moderated by the events team. That's not about necessarily extending the questions to this, but a chance to really connect with your fellow alumni. So now onto the main topic at hand. You may well have read about the Science of Happiness course at the University of Bristol. It's attracted a huge amount of press attention. It was developed by the eminent psychologist, Professor Bruce Hood, and we're really delighted that he's able to join us this evening. I think the course is now more relevant than ever when you look at everything that we're facing as a society. Bruce is going to share this evening a little bit about how the course came about, what some of its content is, and some of the lessons that we can learn collectively as a society. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Bruce so that he can share some of the science of happiness with us all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to all of you on this evening. It's a beautiful summer here, summer's evening in Somerset, and I hope you're enjoying some weather wherever you are. So I'm going to just share the screen now for a moment whilst I just pull up my slide deck. And as Andrew was saying, I teach a course called The Science of Happiness. I'm a professor in psychological science here at the University of Bristol, but my path into happiness has been somewhat odd and obscure. And actually, I don't really regard myself as an expert in happiness. As you'll see, it covers such a broad and vast terrain of different areas that actually I think anyone who calls himself an expert is probably being a bit disingenuous. But I have become increasingly interested in it. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my background. And by the way, before I start, this is relevant to this week, of course. If you weren't aware, it's actual Mental Health Awareness Week, but you'd have to be living under a stone not to recognize that we're currently in the middle of a crisis, which is really impacting on everybody's mental well-being at the moment. Anyway, I started my research, I began as a student in Scotland. I did a degree there, but I focused research-wise on neuroscience, where I went to Cambridge and did a PhD on the brain mechanisms of attention and studied that for some time. Then moved to America, where I did a postdoc looking at human irrational thinking, which of course has become really relevant in the current situation. I then took my first teaching position at Harvard, and I was there for 5 years. But then eventually Europe called me back, and I was very fortunate to be offered a position here at Bristol. And I've been here 20 years now, so a lot longer than Andrew. And it's a delightful place. I'm very pleased to be here. Now, I have been teaching up to this point in time, mostly work on developmental psychology, child psychology, and brain mechanisms and brain development. But about 2 years ago, we started to experience a real phenomenon, especially here at Bristol. We had this, I'm sure you're aware of this, we had this very unfortunate spat of suicides, and we had this real issue of mental health crisis. Now, I just say it from the outset, Bristol is not a toxic environment. In fact, every university right across the sector was experiencing this sort of problem. And so I wanted to do something about it. So I had actually, this wasn't a new problem, by the way. We know that students have always had a problem in the transition to university. In fact, one of my earliest papers from 1987, so that gives you an idea of how old I am, was actually on the transition to university and this problem of homesickness. But a couple of years ago, this started to reach an epidemic kind of situation where we actually had students who were really making this one of their major priorities at coming into the higher education system. So why has it got so bad? Well, if you look at the self-reports of mental health problems, it has been increasing. So over the past 10 years, the numbers who are reporting depression has doubled. And one of the major issues is that previously there wasn't a lot of resources for students to seek out. Now that has changed, and I'd like to just point out that Bristol is at the forefront of providing a lot of student services in mental health and well-being. But even then, there's still a bit of a stigma attached to seeking out help. And I think that is changing, the climate's changing, but still, especially when it comes to international students, they still feel that there's a real stigma to be associated with disclosing that you might have a mental health issue. However, if you ask the students themselves, and this is a report from 2017, around about the time, and this was part of a survey conducted at 16 institutions, and Bristol took part of it. And we had something like 1,700 of our students answer questions about mental well-being. And one of the really stark things to discover is that around half of them had experienced mental health problems. And this suggests that the problem pre-exists before they'd even come to university in many instances. And about 40% we're still having a current issue with mental health. So this is not a trivial issue. This is quite a significant issue. So it really does need addressing. But why are levels rising? Okay, so we know that moving to a new university can be a bit daunting, but why is there this sudden crisis that we've been experiencing? Well, I think there's a number of things which have changed over the years, certainly since I started in higher education. First of all, there's increased awareness. So it's clear that if you are made aware of these sorts of things, then it's much more likely that you'll self-disclose. There's also, I think, an increasing expectation of academic achievement. When I started off at university, I don't know about yourself, but when I started off, the pressure to succeed at university was nowhere near as explicit as I think it is today. And I think this is partly a consequence of an educational system which starts early in primary and secondary schools, where there's a lot of pressure with league tables and educational systems to achieve and get outcomes. So basically the success of the educational system is how many students achieve the top grades. So I think this translates through to the higher education system, and we're seeing the consequences of that now. Of course, tuition fees were introduced, and that's one sort of pressure which is added to students who are concerned about these so eye-watering levels of debt. And of course now, and this is more relevant now than ever, there's a lot of economic uncertainty. So when I was going to university, we weren't going through this digital revolution, but certainly in the past 10, 15 years, a lot of the traditional industries and jobs have disappeared. And so I think students are aware of this uncertainty, and that again puts pressure on them. And then finally, there's the old sort of, the old rogue, social media, that you probably will have heard a lot about. And I think there's a lot which is laid at the feet, or the blame is laid at the feet of social media. And I think there's some great things about it, but I do believe that it can amplify what is already a serious problem. Okay, and part of the issue is that social media presents these unrealistic views of everyone's lives, and people are inherently competitive. So when they see everyone else seemingly having an incredible time posting all their best experiences on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, then this presents this unrealistic comparison, and that can be pretty depressing. So the answer to the question why are levels rising is all of the above. Okay, there's no one single factor which is responsible. All of them are contributing to it. And so this has led a number of us to see if there's anything we can do about it. So about 2 years ago, I became aware that a former Harvard student of mine, Laurie Santos, had this meteoric rise. And you may have heard of her name if you're interested in mental health and well-being. She launched a course about 2 years ago as well, called Psychology and the Good Life at Yale. And this was phenomenally successful. That goes to show that this isn't just a Bristol or indeed a British problem. And indeed, you see the same problems emerging in the Ivy Leagues in America. So I think this issue of mental health is actually right across the board. Anyway, I got in contact with Laurie, we exchanged correspondence, and on the basis of that, I launched a course called The Science of Happiness. Now, initially, in the first year of it, I didn't know if anyone would be interested. I opened it up to everyone. There's no examination. I was just curious to see how many people would turn up. And we had something like 500 people turn up for the initial lectures. So immediately we realized that there was a real demand about this thing called happiness. Now, I call the course The Science of Happiness because I wanted to emphasize that everything I would say was evidence-based. And I really thought this was an opportunity, especially for people who had no background in science, to get a kind of taster of what science is and how you could tackle something like happiness from a scientific perspective. So it combines sort of lectures on the theories in philosophy and psychology and neuroscience, economics even, and history. All of these factors are relevant to the concept of happiness, which is why I said I don't think anyone can really claim to be an expert, because it's such a broad realm of interest for most of us. And in fact, if you look around just about every department in a modern university, somebody's working on something which inevitably contributes to the well-being of our species. So in a sense, we're all kind of working on happiness. Anyway, when it was so successful, we decided to turn it into a credit-bearing course. And this is the press coverage from last year, so you probably will have heard of it. I'm not sure I really believe these figures from the press office. I can't believe there's a reach of 1 billion, but if it was, well, I'm delighted. And as you can see, it was highlighted in the media. Unfortunately, again, we saw this kind of association with the negative aspects of what Bristol has been going through. And I would just emphasize that this course is not a clinical course. It's not designed for people who have clinically severe bouts of depression. Rather, it's a course about living a better life, how to make improvements in life, how to develop positive attitudes and positive habits, which have been shown to increase mental well-being over time. So the course started this year, back in October, and we opened it up, and we had 150 in the first term, which was not bad, considering there being sort of no knowledge about this course to the first years. But when they turned up, we had 150 sign up for the first term and 250 sign up for the second term. So nearly 400 students across the first year of running it. And the way the course worked is that you had to take part, you had to engage in it. So we were putting emphasis on attendance at lectures. Moreover, I banned the use of laptops and smartphones. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you ever sit in a sort of a meeting these days, everyone seems to be looking at their phone and not really focusing. And I found this really frustrating. And indeed, there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that whenever people are pulling out their laptops or on their smartphones, they're not really paying attention to the content. So we banned those. We also banned the use of recorded lectures because increasingly students had been relying on lecture recordings and not turning up to lectures. And this is a problem that I think we're all starting to realize. So you could watch it on request because if you have a student who has sort of special needs or has some problems with learning, then of course you have to give them access to it. But we didn't want to make it just putting these recorded lectures up without considering it, because otherwise students might be tempted not to bother coming along, because it was a social commitment and connection during those lectures was what I was really trying to emphasize. Probably what's most radical about it, and this is really what makes it different from the course at Yale, is there's no examinations. And indeed, the first lecture, I really kind of focus on why I think examinations are counterproductive. But in addition to in order to get your credit, okay, so you had to turn up to lectures, but you also had to turn up to small group meetings of about 8 students. And these were led by senior student mentors. Now, this I think is the secret sauce, because I think it's these intimate meetings. When you get first years, they're like startled rabbits in the first months. You know, they arrive at this institution, they've probably left home for the first time, and they're disoriented. But if you get them into these small groups, they can meet people from different schools and different disciplines, and they can be mentored by these senior students. So these were very, very successful, as we've discovered. And moreover, they actually had to engage in activities, because one of the central tenets of the course is that knowing is not enough. And finally, they had to produce a final reflective project based on something I'd said in the lectures. So as I said, knowing is not enough, action is needed. So I think this is a general principle I'd just like to highlight, that it doesn't matter how many online lectures you listen to or how many podcasts or self-help books you read. It's not going to make one iota of a difference in terms of your mental well-being unless you commit to doing something and changing your own lifestyle. So this is why the course really emphasizes the engagement component of it, and that's how we award the credit. So what do we ask them to do? Well, working with Laurie, we identified 7 areas. I'm not going to go through them all in any detail. Some of these things will be familiar to you, like the value of savoring things or showing gratitude or physical exercise, making sure you get enough sleep. But what we do in the lectures is we go through the science behind it. We present the evidence and how the experiments are conducted so that they can get a real grounding of what is the basis or the reason for why we recommend these things. And the great news is it works. Okay, so here's the data. This is the data from this last term. So in blue, what we have here is this is the first cohort of students who took the course starting in October. It's 12 weeks. And we assessed them on a measure called WEMWEBS, which is a standardized measure of mental well-being. And what you can see in this graph is a significant rise in those students who've taken the course that is sustained through to the February, okay, at the beginning of the second term. In comparison to those students who haven't yet taken the course, these are the ones who are waiting to take it in term 2. So that tells us that if they engage in the course, comply with the requirements, you get these significant effects, which was very exciting. And by the way, it replicated what we'd found in the first run of the course back in 2018. But it only works if you actually get them involved. And that's the real challenge, is getting people to change their ways, to commit to doing things, to leading a more positive life. So what do we actually talk about in the course? Well, I can't condense 12 weeks into 30 minutes, but I thought I'd take you through some of the highlights. So the first thing is, we have a lot of misconceptions about what will make us happy. So we examine the usual suspects of money and success, and we explain why they don't deliver the levels of happiness that people anticipate, which is a real eye-opener for first-year students who have been fed a menu or a recipe for success in life. Namely, you've got to get a first-class degree in order to get into the best jobs and so on and so forth. So we deconstruct that. By the way, I don't demotivate students. I'm not telling them not to bother trying. But what I do try to get them to do is to calibrate their expectations and the amount of effort and to sort of reduce the pressure I think a lot of them come to university with in order to succeed. So we talk about these misconceptions. We also explain why we're so poor at predicting what will make us happy. And there's some really interesting physiology data there that I bring in on that. And then we then turn attention to doing things that make a difference. So this is all based on positive psychology, and we refer to lots of studies which have shown these effects. And we're very stringent on which studies that we highlight, because I think there's a lot of work out there, and you just have to be very careful that you don't oversell the concept, because I think you don't want to dilute the integrity of this real sort of scientific approach, which is what we maintain. Then we talk about how you can overcome your biases, because our brain is a very biased processing system, okay? It's distorted in the sort of comparisons we make. And so we recognize that in the course, and we teach the students to recognize their own biases and how to address them. And then finally, we leave them with a set of strategies, which we hope that they will then apply for not only at their time at university, but take with them out when they graduate and hopefully make a change for better. And that's why the course is called For Better, for Good. Okay, so what is happiness? Okay, well, that term is extraordinarily complex, and we deconstruct it into at least three sort of things. It means different things to different people, but it usually refers to that feeling of positivity and emotional feeling, and that's what we call the affective component of happiness. But there are other things in life which make you happy. There's an aspect of engagement when you're doing something that is really fulfilling, that you find really engrossing. You might get that kind of concept you may have heard of called flow, which shows that you're really matching your abilities to a challenge. And that in itself can be a very fulfilling and positive experience. And then finally, I think happiness can also be derived from leading a meaningful life. Now, this comes from Aristotle, who argued that we really shouldn't be kind of seeking pleasure. What we should be doing is actually seeking to improve the lives of others. And in doing so, we will benefit in our own happiness. So all of these three things we promote in the course and get people to recognize that they're different components of the same basic concept. But how do you measure something like happiness? I mean, it's such an obscure thing. Well, we explain why it's so difficult, because it's a subjective experience, it's a stream of consciousness, but we demonstrate that actually you can use scientific principles to evaluate it. And we take them through various sorts of experiments. For example, is it happiness that makes us successful? Or rather, does success make us happy? Because most people think that it's the former, that it's success makes us happy. And that's why they pursue, first-class honors degrees. But actually, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you try to change people's levels of happiness, then success follows on from that. So that's a really interesting counterintuitive way of seeing it. We explain that correlation doesn't equal causation. So for the non-scientists amongst you, you might be surprised by that. But this is a fundamental principle in science, that if you want to demonstrate that there is a relationship between two things, you've got to do an experimental manipulation in order to demonstrate that one thing is literally causing the other thing to happen, because many things correlate in life and they're not actually related. So again, this is a basic principle of scientific experimentation that we teach people. So here are the three kind of things that we start off in the first couple of lectures, three criticisms you might sort of regard them as why happiness is overrated, okay? So there's a certain generation of people who think that this is a millennial thing, okay? Happiness is a kind of trivial thing. They should be thinking about hard work and it'll pass, okay? These millennials are snowflakes with no resilience and individual and all that. Or they think that happiness is really self-centered gratification, that they shouldn't be focusing on their happiness, they should be working harder. And then there are some people who think, well, you can't change the way you are because happiness is fixed. Well, it's certainly not a millennial thing, and this is the data of the general public in the UK from 93 to 2014. And you can see year on year, there has been rising incidences of the common mental disorders of anxiety and depression. So around 1 in 6 adults currently has a problem. I suspect, actually, if you were to run that study now, it would be even higher. Okay, and we'll look at some of that data in a moment. Yes, there is a blip around about 16 to 24 years in females, but in general, this is a problem throughout the population. Moreover, governments are starting to pay attention to this now. Of course, they're now starting to develop these league tables of happiness. And here's one from 2016. And by the way, it's the usual suspects of the Nordic countries which top the polls in terms of happiness. And we're a bit further down. But what's more alarming is if you look at the change in happiness over the same period, we are going in the wrong direction. So UK is 91st and the US is 103rd. Whereas other countries, obviously these are countries coming out of civil wars, they're experiencing much greater happiness. But we as this industrialized Western countries seem to be going in the wrong direction. And I think our leaders are starting to pay attention to that. They're starting to become more aware of the consequences of mental health on productivity. People who are happy are selfish. Well, that's not true. Happier people are much more generous, and moreover, they often give things that they can ill afford to do so. And this has always perplexed economists. In fact, they've got a term for it called warm glow. And it turns out that actually there's very good reasons for why we give. And for example, here's a study that I might typically talk about in this section of the course, where they look at the effect of persuading people to donate money over a 4-week period. And then they do various imaging techniques to see if any of the specific brain areas related to happiness or identity or rewards are activated. And what you find is that people who have committed to being generous to others experience a activation in those areas which are their own reward centers, the ventral striatum, okay? So what that effectively means is that when you are generous to other people, you are yourself experiencing that as a positive reward in yourself. Now, you could argue, well, that's not altruism, that's self-interest, but it doesn't really matter because the net result is that everyone benefits. Finally, this idea that happiness is fixed, you can't change it. The glass is half empty or the glass is half full. Well, believe it or not, you can actually apply science to this question, and in particular in the realm of behavioral genetics. So we do have one lecture explaining how you tease apart the various relationships of genes and experience. To give you the bottom line, and this is from Sonia Lyubomirsky's analysis, it turns out that levels of happiness, the genetic component of it, is never really more than around about 50%. So yes, you do inherit your dispositions from your parents to a certain extent, but on average across a population, it's no more than around about 50%. So what is else contributing to your levels of happiness? Well, surprisingly, life events, major life events, are only 10%. Now, this is a real surprise to most people because they assume that if you win the lottery, this will be life-changing. If you have a divorce, it will be life-changing. You'll never return to levels as before. But in fact, one thing that we do know about humans is that we're remarkably adaptive and flexible, and they do change back to baseline levels. So what's the remainder? If it's not your genes and it's not uncontrollable life events, well, this is what Lyubomirsky calls intentional activities. And effectively, this is the way that you process information. These are the things that you do in order to make your life better, whether that's social networks or you adopt positive habits. So this is where you can actually make a difference. This is where positive psychology can change things. You can't change your genes and you can't change life events, which are unpredictable, but you can change the way that you process them. And that's what we emphasize in the course. But is it possible to become happier in the long term? This, I think, to be honest, is we don't really know. I think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that with effort sustained over time, you will see rises in mental well-being. But I think the jury's out, and that shows I'm still a skeptical scientist. I want to see the evidence before I start making exotic claims that we can change people forever. Because the problem is that we're on a hedonic treadmill. We adapt to situations, both good and bad. So whilst you might get these sort of small boosts of happiness by engaging in one of these happiness hacks I told you about, then unless you sustain it, you'll go back down to your baseline levels again. So this brings me to the current situation. We are currently facing unprecedented stress across the world and in this country as well. This is a report from the Royal College of Psychiatrists saying that we're facing a tsunami of mental illness. And I think this is obviously going to happen with the economic uncertainty that the country is facing. For example, this is from the campaign to eradicate loneliness. They have data 2 weeks prior to the lockdown and 2 weeks afterwards. You can see in every age group that loneliness has doubled as a result of the lockdown. So effectively, we're in a difficult time. So how do you deal with it? Well, I've actually been doing a lot more work now than before, believe it or not, because people are so interested in happiness. They've been contacting me and saying, well, what can you do about it? And I've been delivering versions of the course, The Science of Happiness, to various institutions. And in fact, just last week, we started delivering it to the University of Bristol. And what we've done is we've taken a model that I've been delivering at the BBC. So this is a 4-week course. And again, it's a kind of It's a rapid tour through it. We begin by explaining what happiness is. We introduce the happiness hacks. Then I tell them about ways to change the ways that they think, how to develop more meditative states, how to combat ruminative negative thoughts, really valuable tips and procedures. And then finally, the last lecture is how to achieve your goals. So again, this is a combination of a variety of techniques, combinations with theory and practice. Importantly, we ask them to do a self-assessment, because I think if you really want to change things, you've got to track it. We have weekly journaling activities. Journaling is really important. And nudging is what I'm going to tell you about in a moment, because in fact, I'm very grateful to the Alumni Association because you've provided me with support to evaluate this. And then we produce a final report. So the sorts of homework that we give our participants, if you like, here's just an example. We might give them a week's homework of writing on 3 good things. We get them to write it down, because journaling is a very powerful way of keeping track of your life. It takes these negative thoughts, it makes them tangible, it provides you with a roadmap about how to deal with it. And I like the quote from the musician Nick Cave. He says, "The written word can put to rest many imagined demons." So we've been applying that same technique we developed for the BBC to our staff as well. The problem is that when you're in a lockdown situation, you can't have those small one-to-one meetings. And so we've been using remote coaching. And this is a way for individuals to keep track of their progress, because if you want to make a change, it's like losing weight or anything like that. You've got to keep track of it. It's the best way to do it. So we've been evaluating this nudge technology app. It's an app that you can download, and this connects you to one of 3 coaches. This is myself, Sarah Gelbert, and my colleague Ellie Wright. And what this enables the students to do is to not only track their homework, but it enables them also to have a connection with other people in the group and connecting with their mentor. And so I think this is a powerful way of really providing the support and the incentive, the carrot and stick, as it were, to keep people engaged in this process. So as I said, we started this process with staff and students at Bristol. Over 700 registered for the course, which started last week. And we have data, 500 of them have completed a time 1 assessment. And we're going to take 90 of them and put them into this intense coaching situation, the nudging, to see if this adds value to the whole experience. And of course, we don't have the data yet, but if you invite me back in 2 months' time, I'll be able to tell you whether it's worked in the short term, and who knows, if you invite me back next year, has this had a sustained effect? But I would just make this general point. There's no quick fixes to improving mental well-being. And I think you need to have a degree of skepticism about claims that it can be done. It's a little bit like physical strength, okay? You don't suddenly just pick up a weight and become physically strong and physically resilient. That was more likely to give you a hernia. If you want to develop mental resilience in the same way as you want to develop physical strength, then you have to take your time and you have to engage in the process on a regular and consistent program. And over time, you will build up that process. And that's what I believe is the secret to becoming leading a better life, is actually engaging in that. So the final plans, this is the final slide. What are we going to do? Well, the remote coaching isn't going to work, because it's great putting these online courses and doing this stuff through the new technology, but you're losing that intimacy of the social connection. But can you compensate with it with this kind of nudging remote coaching technology? We're also going to start looking at integrating well-being as the Science of Happiness course with other initiatives on the campus. So, for example, we have people who do mindfulness meditation classes or yoga classes, or indeed physical exercise is something that we recommend. Maybe we can get them to get sort of discounted membership at the gyms. Other universities are interested, so we're delivering the Science of Happiness to Cardiff in the autumn, and Southampton just contacted me today to say whether or not we could deliver something for their students as well. We have some business programs, so we're developing corporate versions, and I've been working obviously with the BBC I just told you about, and there's a podcast. Unfortunately, I had to go on hiatus because with the social distancing, we couldn't go and do the recording. But I'm assured that after we come out of lockdown, we'll pick up on that, and hopefully, we'll have something to broadcast to everyone. And finally, this is a question I want to pose to you. It wouldn't be easy, but I think it's possible to develop a web-based course. And is this something that you, the alumni, would be interested in? So I'm actually going to run a poll now because I've been asked to sort of gauge the interest in it. So let's just call this up. And would you take time now to answer this poll. Would you want to take part in an online interactive version of the Science of Happiness course? Okay, so the poll is running away now. And we're nearly 82%. We'll stop at around about 90% correspondence, completion. And let's end the poll. Okay, so let's share the results. So I think that seems to strongly suggest that maybe we should be putting some effort into developing a solution which works online. Now, there are other online courses, but my whole point is that I think the biggest hurdle is getting people to commit to it. I think it's very easy to get people to sign up to courses, but getting them to sustain it, that's a real challenge. So I think if we do go ahead with this, then I'll have my task cut out for me. But for the moment, I'm going to just end up there, I believe, and take your questions. So I'll stop sharing the slide and hand it back to Andrew.
So thank you so much, Bruce. That's such an interesting and pertinent subject, I think, for all of us. So we were delighted that we had quite a few questions submitted before this evening's talk. Yeah. So what we thought we'd do is start off with a few of those, but then we'll go to the live question and answer tab. So if you do have questions, if you can start posting them on the question and answer, and then we'll try and moderate and draw out some questions from those. So the first one was a question that we received from Sarah McLaughlin, which is, how do we prepare for the anxiety of returning to normal?
So it's going to take a long time to return to normal. It's not going to be a sudden transition. And of course, we've never been in this situation before. So that's why I think it naturally is inducing a lot of anxiety. The one thing that humans don't like is unpredictable and uncontrollable events, because that induces stress. You see, we have an evolved system to deal with threat and potential threats called the fight or flight response. And that's very effective in the short term when we can identify the problem that we have to deal with. But if the problem is uncertain and not very obvious, then that means we're in a sustained level of arousal, which is counterproductive to mental health. And that's when you're getting into a chronic stress situation, which, by the way, compromises your immune system. So we don't know at what point we're going to be returning to normal. And there's a lot of unknowns. And so what I would suggest is that coming out of the situation, we have to recognize there are some things that we're simply not going to be able to control. Okay, and this really reflects what is Stoic philosophy wisdom, which is the Stoic philosophers said, look, you have to recognize what you can control in life and what you cannot control in life. And don't put your emotional energies into the things you can't control, but rather use your emotional energies in the things that you can control. Now, it sounds obvious, but it's something that we also easily forget because we worry about pandemics, we worry about economic downturn. And rather, what the Stoics argue is that we should focus on our reaction to these events. So I would suggest that we're due for turbulent waters. Recognize that's going to be the situation. There are some things that we simply are out of our control. And the real secret is to identifying the things that we do have some control to, and then try and do something about it. But even if we can't change those uncontrollable events, what we can do is we can mitigate or moderate our emotional response to it by recognizing that they're out of our control.
Thank you very much. So following up from that is a question from Richard Skelton, which is, what's one strategy that you would recommend to increase children's resilience?
So I think this really does depend on the age of the child. And I think if a child is capable of documenting, even simply rudimentarily writing down, so we're talking about middle childhood and onwards, if they can start to articulate what their concerns or worries are. I'm a great fan of journaling. I mentioned it in the talk. And we actually, and I didn't tell you during the talk, but we actually analyze the journals that our students write. It's all treated anonymously. We run it through machine learning algorithms. But what we're doing is we're looking for patterns of emotional expression. And what we're discovering in the journaling is it's incredibly important. It seems to play a very productive role in reducing anxiety and depression. As I think it's because it takes what are ruminative thoughts and makes them tangible. And simply putting it down on paper seems to have a very powerful effect. So I think if a child is old enough to start doing that, that's a good start. And also, I would emphasize the fact that when you create a journal or a diary, that's going to be a legacy, because we're all going to come out of this at some point. And I think it'd be really interesting to look back on this time and reflect upon our anxieties and concerns and how we dealt with them. Because as I say, this is unprecedented in our history as a species in many ways. And so I think this is, it's not so much an opportunity, but I think it's a piece of self-reflection that I think will be very valuable to us moving forward. So journaling I would recommend, and documenting it is very important. If a child is very young, then the only thing I could possibly imagine is that I've done work on very young children's attachment objects and teddy bears and stuff like that. And sometimes if they can talk to the teddy bear, they can articulate it to the adult. That's another way of just expressing these underlying concerns. The last thing you should try to do is try to ignore negative thoughts. Okay, try to suppress them. That never works. In fact, this is called ironic suppression, because the more you try not to think about bad things, the more they come back stronger and stronger, which, by the way, is when you're lying in bed at night trying not to worry about something, you can't get to sleep because it actually makes your mind more active, not worrying. So document it down, write it on paper, and you'll see the benefits almost immediately.
Fantastic, thank you. And then one final question that was submitted beforehand was from Stephen Peters, and it was, how is happiness as related to well-being understood in populations or communities around the world?
Right, so this is a fascinating question. We do actually have a whole lecture on the economics of happiness, and I showed you a graph which was the World League Tables of Happiness, and I pointed out the Nordic countries. This has really been a shift in attitude in Western governments post-war, because after the Second World War, governments were really focused on gross domestic product, and so it was all into selling goods to our worldly neighbors. And that's how they measured success of a country in terms of its economic output. But increasingly, we've begun to realize that you might have a very wealthy country with a very unhappy population. And so people turned to this small country in the Himalayas called Bhutan. And Bhutan, the leader of Bhutan, argued that rather than a gross domestic product, we should have this concept which he called the gross happiness product. And really what that is it's a measure of well-being, but it's also a measure of your society's attitudes towards, for example, climate change, all sorts of things which they regard as how to lead a better life. And of course, Bhutan is in the center of the Buddhist colony of tradition. And so Buddhism has also predicted or also promoted the idea that happiness should be the priority, not economic success. So Western countries prioritize individualism and capitalist systems for many decades, but increasingly now I think we're seeing a shift back to more Eastern traditions about the value of leading a better life and actually enriching society, because that will actually end up making you more productive, rather than putting everything into the stress of trying to do a 9 to 5.
Thank you. Food is definitely for thought. So I'm going to turn to some of the live questions. And so Jeremy Foster has said, are we in danger of comparing being alone with loneliness? The former can be a good thing for self-reflection, etc., and not necessarily a mental health issue.
Absolutely. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Some people can be incredibly popular and still feel lonely. It's all to do with the perception. And some people would prefer not to be in crowds, and that is what we call solitude. So yes, it's an important distinction to make. And indeed, when we do assess this, so this is one of the measures that we assess in our students, we make this distinction and we talk about, are you alone or do you feel lonely? And so they're not the same point. And yes, I would not force people into social connections if they feel uncomfortable about that. And this is another point I should make, is that we do have a principle that one size does not fit all. So what we encourage our students to do is to examine all the various activities that we promote and discover what works for them best, but at least to try them out. Because people have preconceptions about what they think will make them happy or uncomfortable. For example, a lot of people believe that striking up a conversation with a stranger will be awkward. But it turns out that if you actually force people to do that, then they actually experience a lot more happiness than they would imagine. So if you never try that out, you'll never discover that, which probably is very relevant in the current situation where we've been forced into unusual circumstances, which have meant that we've had to break our usual habits. And we've discovered the benefits of making those social connections. But if you're someone who doesn't like social interaction, then forcing someone to do that is pointless. So I think you need to discover what you're comfortable with and what works for you, but at least be open to trying different things.
Thank you. So a question from Ruth Alexander. This may sound a little pessimistic, but are humans meant to be happy? Are we making ourselves unhappy by expecting to be so?
Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think that's part of the issue is that when you're looking at Facebook and they're seeing everyone's levels of happiness, that compounds your own sense of failure. So that's kind of the issue. I would say if you talk about optimism and pessimism, okay, so let's assume that there is a relationship between optimism and happiness, and indeed there is. It turns out that life expectancy in optimists is 10 to 15% longer than life expectancy in pessimists. So if you regard living longer as a positive outcome, then yes, being happier is better.
Okay. I remember you talking before about the fact that when I've heard you speak before about the fact that actually being in a constant state of happiness though is obviously mania, and so that there's an expectation about the constant state of happiness and the fact that we need to understand the relationship and the ebbs and flows of emotion.
Yes, and that's actually what we covered in the first lecture. I have this flippant throwaway line that if you're constantly happy, you probably have a clinical condition of mania, as you pointed out. No, you need to experience the lows in order to evaluate the highs. Of course, that's one of the problems of measuring happiness is it fluctuates. And getting back to the previous question, one person's happiness is another person's nightmare. So going to Glastonbury, and being immersed socially, some people say that'd be great, but others would think that'd be a nightmare. So it fluctuates and it depends on exactly what you're doing. But yeah, you don't want to be constantly, you need to be aware that it's okay to not feel great. And that's part of the process. But you can, over time, and I'm increasingly believing this, the evidence supports this, you can shift people's perspectives to leading more fulfilling lives by basically shifting their energies and focus away from a kind of materialist pursuit of individualism and comparison, which unfortunately is characteristic of a lot of Western thought, or has been at least for the past couple of decades.
So we have a question from somebody who took your course when it first ran. So from Christina, who says one of the key takeaways was that social connections were one of the main ways to improve your happiness levels. In the times of social distancing, this is no longer an option in the way that was taught on the course. How can we navigate this absence of connection and remain happy?
That's a great question. And you're absolutely right, Christina. If you remember, we used to start the lecture with a very unusual beginning, and I won't get you to say it, but we used to get everyone to turn to the person next to them and introduce themselves and strike up a conversation. And I was really emphasizing that the most sort of what motivates us is happiness, and a lot of that happiness is derived from others around us. And so that's why I always emphasize that. But you're right, we're in a lockdown situation, and it looks like we'll be in a degree of social isolation or separation for some period of time. And I think what we can try to do is use the new technologies, and certainly it's not the same, and I think it would be facile to say it's the same. It's very different. It's very weird speaking to your computer. It loses a lot of the nuances of it, but we are a flexible species. And what I have noticed, and I don't know if anyone would agree with this, is if anyone else is on Twitter, I've seen what I think is almost a moderating effect of some of the nastiness on Twitter. Now, there's a lot of aggression always towards, the usual suspects, like politicians, and blaming people for situations. But in terms of the general correspondence, it seems to have become, in my view, and maybe it's just me being hopeful, people seem to be a little kinder to each other. So I think the technologies are awkward. They do allow you to have connections with others, but that connection, I don't believe is as good as the real thing. But we will come out of this at the other end. And as I say, if you can do anything to help other people, then you'll benefit from it. You'll feel better about it. So yes, it's a challenging time. It's very difficult, but try to be flexible.
This is a very personal observation, but something that I've noticed is that possibly because people have been starved of that normal social contact that they have with their friends or with their wider social group, actually the pleasantries are coming out in terms of when you're out for a walk, people are saying hello and acknowledging each other and strangers, and that contact of actually seeing people. And I remember again hearing you speak before about the fact that it doesn't need to be an in-depth conversation. Sometimes just that physical connection is positive. And I think in the lockdown that seems to have been more evident in society.
You're absolutely right, Andrew. And actually, thank you for reminding me that I should have shared that as well. I live in a small community who, frankly, don't really talk to each other. But that has all changed. And now we're kind of saying hello, and I live out in the country, and we're sharing eggs and whatever. And previously, that small community thing, it used to exist. But of course, when people from the towns moved out to the countryside, they forgot that that's an important component of small communities. But now that we've been forced to live at home and actually share that space, yeah, I've had exactly that same experience, that I'm now striking up conversations just for the sheer hell of it, and then finding it's actually very rewarding.
Quite a philosophical question here. So from Ming Teo, you have not mentioned about the distinction between happiness and joy. This is emphasized in many religions where for example, there can be joy, not happiness, in bereavement despite the loss, or there can be empty happiness in holidays, but one does not reach levels of joy. Is there a real difference, or is this just semantics?
I think it can be an issue of semantics, but I would point to Aristippus, the Greek philosopher, and compare him to Aristotle. So Aristippus, he coined the term hedonism. Okay, and hedonism is that elation that you're talking about, the joy. And he argued that humans are hedonistic, and they seek pleasure and avoid pain in its basic term. But Aristotle criticized Aristippus and said, look, any animal can seek gratification. Humans have a moral sense of what's important. And so he was the one who promoted the concept of eudaimonia, which is leading a meaningful life. And he argued that if you do that, then as a byproduct of enriching the lives of others through meaningful activities, you will feel happier yourself. Now, as to the kind of joy and grieving, I'm not sure that's something that everyone would resonate, but I do get your point that it's not a solitary, unitary mental state. And I maybe didn't make that clear enough in my short introduction, but we do address this point in the lectures, that actually it does fluctuate, it's very subjective, it's not the same for everyone, and there are different states. So as I was explaining, that state of flow is when you get that kind of immersion or engagement in an activity, which really brings out a sense of success and satisfaction. So satisfaction and joy and elation, they're all part of happiness, but they're not the same thing. So yes, it's a multifaceted thing. So it's not simply semantics. There are different features of mental states which people recognize as being different facets of happiness.
And so the question from Joanna Myers is around, there seems to be a lot of overlap with regular therapies. Do you think that the key difference is a large psychoeducative component?
Yes, I do. And the reason I say that is because we have noticed that there are a number of people who are very skeptical about the concept of trying to raise happiness. And when you embed it within a psychological framework which has evidence-based data, and when you start to uncover some of the mechanisms, and when you demonstrate many counterintuitive experiences, so Andrew, you will have known the things that I do with the illusions, which really play with your mind, then you demonstrate that you don't have any direct contact with reality. Your brain is always constructing things, and that's also true of happiness. So what I do in the course is I can take sort of fundamental principles of experimental science, if you like, and demonstrate their application into this sort of positive psychology, because unfortunately a lot of positive psychology is a little bit kind of, I got to choose my words carefully, but it's not always as rigorous as other sciences. And I think that's unfortunate, because I do think they're tackling something which is fundamentally important. And I would say that I've never had more attention than when I've been talking about happiness compared to when I'm talking about brain mechanisms of the superior colliculus and eye movement control. People turn off, but as soon as you say happiness, they're interested. So I think what I'm trying to do in this course is combine that kind of general interest in improving happiness with rigorous science in doing so. And I think that's a valuable exercise. And I would also just add, this approach has been really appreciated by international students, because acknowledging that you may have an issue with mental health or even talking about it is not regarded as acceptable in many cultures. It's considered a sign of weakness or taboo. And so I think we do attract a number of students who are very intrigued about exploring this. But I would finally emphasize, this is not a clinical course, okay? So this is not designed to deal with people who have clinical conditions. And we do get a lot of people coming onto the course seeking some solution to their problems. And I do say that right at the beginning, this is not going to be a solution. But at the very least, you'll come away with some understanding about how science approaches this topic. And who knows, if you do adopt some of these strategies, then I think it will enrich the lives of not you, but people around you.
So touching on those strategies, and I'm conscious of what you just said, but we've had a question come through from Christina that says, how could someone deal with negative thoughts that keep coming back? Are there any tips or specific task suggestions to help avoid this?
All right, I'm going to give you one now. So this is a bit of audience participation. I haven't even got a poll set up. There's 214 people on at the moment. This is a very simple technique I'm going to demonstrate to you right now. I want everyone to think of a serious problem, a real problem that you're worried about, okay? I want you to think about that problem. What is this problem? And I want you to say out loud, you don't have to do it, Andrew, because I can hear you. For the rest of you, I want you to say, I am worried about unemployment because I may lose my job or something like that. I just take a moment and say that out loud to yourself. Say a statement, I am worried about something because of something. Okay, that didn't feel great. Do it again, but this time, rather than saying, I am worried about this because of this, I want you to use your first name. I want you to say, Bruce is worried about unemployment because of whatever. Repeat that and then examine your experience. Now, if I was to ask you in a poll, and we've done this many times before, over 90% of people find that when you say it using your own name, it seems to be less stressful. It seems to be less worrisome. When you use I, it just feels so much more intense. So that's a simple strategy, that's a simple technique which just tricks the brain momentarily from an ego perspective of dealing with problems to stepping outside of yourself and talking to yourself as if you're a best friend. And we've all done this when we've had friends come to us with an immediate crisis or a problem or a negative thought. We say, look, don't worry about it, Bruce. You'll be okay. You've got all these other things. So that simple technique is a very simple strategy that we would talk about and how it works and the brain mechanisms of it.
So I think we've got probably time for one final question, which I'm going to finish with one from Lana Baker-Mutton, which is, do you think rather than saying we should be aiming for happiness, we should aim to strive for mental stability? Would that make us all more fulfilled?
Yes, I think that's a fair point. I mean, to be honest, I used the term happiness because I wanted to come up with a term that everyone recognized, that was very simple, that was catchy, which promised something. And that's why I use the word happiness. But as I've been at pains to point out, happiness is a multi-complex term. It fluctuates all the time. And yes, I think stability would be a better state of mind. And of course, this is exactly what Buddhists and more meditative approaches argue for, that you shouldn't be trying to raise your levels of happiness because you will get the inevitable come down, okay? So yes, I think that if you can gradually become more serene, if you want, and engage in activities which are much more balanced without disrupting your own life, or more importantly, disrupting the lives of people around you, then that's a goal that we should all aim for.
Thank you ever so much, Bruce. And I'm sorry, but I think we're pretty much out of time now. I know we haven't answered all the questions. Just in case you're wondering, we had over 50 questions come through on that question and answer panel. And what we were trying to do was take a sample that were representative of the kind of questions and themes that were coming through. If you do have any specific questions that you would like an answer to, or any thoughts or reflections, remember, please do email alumni-events@bristol.ac.uk, and we will try our hardest to get back to you with any answers that we can do, and we'll talk to Bruce and talk to others if we can get back to you with answers. So, I mean, thank you. I think it just shows the real warmth and enthusiasm that there is for the subject, and real interest that there is in the subject as well. So I think all that largely remains for me to do this evening is to say thank you so much to Bruce. Thank you for giving up your time and for giving us such a rich, varied and interesting talk. I think there are lessons that we can all take from that, and things that we can put into practice. And what I personally find is, I think this is now my third or fourth time cheating and hearing you speak at different events, Bruce. But every time I find that there's something different that I can take away and actually opens my mind or makes me view things in a slightly different way as I'm approaching life every day. And so thank you so much for that. I also want to say a massive thank you to the events team within Darrow. So to Caroline, to Joe, and to Ali, who are behind those black tabs that you can see if you're on the gallery view. They've been working really hard to transition an entire events program. So we had never done a digital event before, and 6 weeks ago we decided that we needed to digitize our events given the current situation, and I've been working ever so hard to put this together, and we're really glad that over 200 of you have joined us for this event, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. So just a signpost to our next event. Our next event is taking place next Thursday, and it's a virtual coffee morning where I'll be speaking with John Phillips, who is chair of the Alumni Association. We'll be having a discussion about the ways in which the alumni community are involved in helping at the moment, what some of the current challenges are facing the university, but also an opportunity to share the future vision of some of the things that we're planning for Darrow and for Bristol and for our alumni community. Also, we'll be taking questions, and so if you have any broad questions about development and alumni relations at the university or wider questions about the university, we'll do our very best to answer those. So finally, just to say, in a moment, I'm going to log off and say thank you ever so much. But when I log off, then the events team are going to be enabling the chat function. So if you look down at the bottom of your screen and you can see the chat button, you'll be able to click and then engage and talk via text with any of the other participants in this call. So thank you again for being part of our very first event. We are really proud that you've joined us this evening and taken the time out of your evenings for what I hope was a very fascinating talk. Look forward to seeing you next week. Please stay safe, look after each other. Hope you all stay well, and look forward to speaking to you very soon. Many thanks.